Good morning. This is George Spees with the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records with our weekly Wednesday webinar. And this morning's topic is records management. However, we're going to focus on state agencies this morning. Now, if you happen to not be from a state agency, you still may find the content here interesting, and you're welcome to sit in. Our guest this morning is Tyler Stump from the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission Records Services Division. And if you've participated in these webinars before, you know that Tyler's the man when it comes to records management. Just a couple preliminaries to get these out of the way. This presentation is PowerPoint based with Tyler narrating in the background. Typically, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the conversation pane, and at some point during the presentation, we'll do our best to get to your question. If by chance it appears that it's particularly complex or, unique to your particular situation, we'll do one of two things. We'll wait until the end of the presentation and come back to it, or we'll take the conversation offline through email, phone call, or whatever. We'll try and get you steered in the right direction. I do ask that you keep your questions brief and that you keep them on topic to records management for state government. Okay, one other announcement in that next week we will not be hosting any webinars because I'm going to be on vacation, and everyone around here knows that I'm irreplaceable. But we'll be back in 2 weeks to start over with our series and get back onto the regular schedule with webinars. But with no further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tyler. Good morning, Tyler.
All right, thanks, George. Let me just get settled here and we'll jump right into it. Okay. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for listening in today. As George mentioned, my name is Tyler Stump, and I am an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives, which is one bureau within the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. We're located here in Harrisburg, so if you work in Harrisburg, we're that big, tall tower with no windows on it, just a block away from the Capitol. That's where we store all the records. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the basics of records management and electronic records best practices for state agencies. And as George mentioned, I've done a version of this presentation with open records before, but that's been geared towards county and municipal governments. So today we're going to focus on state agencies and offices particularly. So there are some differences between different levels of government and what the records management rules and kind of policies are. So we're going to focus on state today, but I think some of the principles that we'll talk about are going to be relevant no matter what level of government you work in. There's a lot of really important overlap between records, rules, and policies that the archives and that the Office of Open Records have. So I think this is a really good opportunity. I'm glad I'm here to be able to speak with you all today, so I'm really grateful to George for having me. Okay, so records management. Records. Records can be overwhelming if we don't keep on top of them. I'm sure all of us have had a situation in the past where we couldn't find a record, or we thought we had a record and it wasn't where it was supposed to be, or something like that. But with the help of the Commonwealth's records retention manuals and some other resources that we have and some tools and tips that I'll talk about, managing your office's records can be cost-effective, efficient, and decrease your own agency's liabilities so that you can focus on the important work that you are there to do and that your office is here to do with the Commonwealth. By the end of this webinar today, you should have a good sense of generally what the rules are that are out there in the Commonwealth and how to make sure that you're following them and being compliant. And we'll also talk about some important things about creating and storing electronic records, which it seems like every year electronic records get a little more complicated with some new technology or a new policy that the Commonwealth has issued. And we'll also talk about the Commonwealth's relatively new now permanent electronic records policy that was issued a couple of years back. Okay, So before we dive in, I'm just going to add this caveat again, like I mentioned before. Pennsylvania has different records management rules for state, county, local governments, and for school districts. And although a lot of these are similar, the laws and policies that govern records management at each level of government are different. So I was asked to focus on the rules and procedures for state government today. So if you're listening in and you don't work for the state, just keep in mind whenever I'm referencing specific policies and laws, it's going to be a little bit different for you. But like I said, the principles and kind of the ideas behind good records management are going to be the same. And so if you have a question and you work in a municipality or a county or a school district, feel free to reach out to me after this presentation at any time. No matter what level of government you work at, though, the end goal of records management is all the same. So take a minute and just think about how your office manages its records. And what does records management really mean? The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania defines records management as, and I'm going to read out the whole quote from the actual policy, records management is, quote, planning, controlling, directing, organizing, training, promoting, and other managerial activities involved with respect to records creation, records maintenance and use, and records disposition in order to achieve adequate and proper documentation of the policies and transactions of the Commonwealth for an effective and economical management of agency operations. That's a very nice definition. It's very technical, it's very precise, but it's also really wordy, and it's hard to understand what we're really talking about with records management. I like to say that in government, records management really boils down to three key things. One, ensuring that information is available from the time that it is created to the time that it is disposed of to allow our government to function. Two, we want to protect the interests of government and its constituents. And three, we want to do all of this at the lowest possible cost. We don't want records management to be a giant burden, either in terms of funds that we have to use for it, or staff time, or space to store records, or any of those other things. We don't want it to be taxing us that much. So what does that actually mean for us? Hopefully none of us have records that are stored in any kind of storeroom that looks like this, just a mountain of records. This is kind of a records disaster. This is a great example of bad records management. There's a ton of material here, but if you had a particular record in there that you had to retrieve, how would you know where to look? How would you know if it was actually in there or not? And here's just another angle of that pile of record. Think about the risks that come with storing records like this. Oversaving records, storing them indefinitely, or even just longer than needed, it makes it really hard to locate anything, and that was a major problem for this particular office. You would still have to produce any records that were in that giant pile of record if there was litigation or a right-to-know request, or even just a regular office need for those particular records. It doesn't matter if it's hard to find or not. If it's your record, it's your responsibility to find it and locate it if it's yours. And going through this many records when they're stored in a bad way or they're not managed well can be very costly to your staff and hurt your office's bottom line. Having too many records or having records that you shouldn't have at a certain time can impede your records readiness and makes it harder to protect your essential records that you may need if there's ever an emergency or something like that. And I know we talked with several offices that when the pandemic started last year and all their staff went home and people were kind of scrambling to make sure that they could do their work from home and take whatever they needed at home with them, and they weren't able to find certain records because they were stored maybe off-site or in a weird location or something where they couldn't find it. And so that was a big issue because they weren't really ready for that. They weren't managing their records well ahead of time. So the first rule of records management, and this is something I'll talk about several times in this presentation, we want to keep records only as long as necessary, and then we want to try and get rid of them as quickly as we can. The longer that we're keeping records, the greater cost and liability they're going to pose to the Commonwealth, to the agency that we work in, and to your office in specifically too. And here's a good picture of the office that we were looking at earlier with their big mound of records. After they were applying records management policies and procedures, they were able to reduce the amount of records that they were storing to something that's a little bit more manageable, something that's a little bit easier to go through and figure out what's what and where it is, and also label those records so they're easy to find. Going back to what we had a couple slides back, that's much more difficult to manage than something like this, I think. And I think you'll find if you're applying good records management policies and procedures, you should expect the same change in how easy it is to access all the records, whether they're paper or electronic in your office. Okay, so before we get any further into records management and the records schedules and everything which you may have heard of in the past, let's make sure that we're all on the same page with what a record actually is. So think about that for a moment. what is a record? Or if somebody asked you to define, what a record is in your office, what would you tell them? So Management Directive 210.5, which is the main policy that the Commonwealth has for state records management, it defines a record as, quote, any papers, dockets, books, maps, photographs, or other documentary materials, regardless of physical form or characteristic, made or received by an entity under law or in connection with the exercise of its powers and the discharge of its duties. The definitions for county and municipal offices are really similar to this as well. And the Open Records Act also uses a similar definition to define what a record actually is. So when we talk about records, we're talking about information primarily. It doesn't matter if a record is paper or electronic, or if it's microfilm, if you still have that, or if it's anything else. It's the information that's in that makes it the record. As long as something is recorded evidence of your agency's business and activities, it is considered a record legally and by the Commonwealth's records management policies. So we should keep in mind that this record or definition of a record also extends to documents that are created by vendors or contractors if it's related to business that our agency is doing with them as well. Really, just if it documents any kind of work or duties that our agency is undertaking, then it's probably going to be considered a record. So we've said that any record that's generated or maintained by any of our offices is considered an official Commonwealth record. And these are all subject to requirements of state records laws and records management policy and subject to the right to know law. However, if you have published material that's used for reference or duplicate copies of documents, blank forms, things that don't contain original or official information from your office about your office's work, these may be considered what are called either duplicate records or reference copies of records, or sometimes non-records. There's several different terms that we use. But basically the point is that if you have these types of records that are just being used for kind of reference purposes or kind of administrative purposes, the rules that the Commonwealth has is that these are not assigned specific retention periods, and you don't have to keep them for a certain amount of time. You just need to keep them for as long as they're useful for your agency business, and then you can dispose of them. The same goes for personal emails and other papers that staff may have in their office that they just have for personal reasons. Except for personal records, anything that's in your office, whether it's an official record or a duplicate record or anything, it can still be requested under a right to know request, and you would have to produce that. But if it's not an official Commonwealth record or it's a duplicate, you don't have to keep it for any set amount of time, so you can get rid of it at any point also when you don't need to have it for agency business anymore either. Okay, so let's keep moving. Okay, this is probably the most important slide that I have in this webinar. Who can help you manage your records if you work in a state agency? And I have here on the screen the best sources of information and help for anybody no matter where you work in state government. We'll talk about each of these with an individual slide. But the four pieces are the four places to look for information and help. One is your agency records coordinator, and this is the assigned staff person in your agency who is there to help with all records, questions, and needs that you may have. Second is the records management website that the state archives maintains, and we have a lot of important resources here, technical leaflets, guides for lots of different situations and questions that people may have with records. Pretty much anything that you can think of, we probably have a resource that addresses it. The next thing is the Commonwealth's general and agency records retention schedules, and copies of these are on our website. And these will tell you exactly how long you need to keep every type of record that you have in your office, and how to dispose of those records when the end of their retention happens. And finally, there's the State Archives and the Office of Administration's Records Management section, and that's where I come in. That's where I work. I work in the archives. Our offices work together to oversee the Commonwealth's records management program, and we're always around to clarify any tricky questions or specific questions that may not be addressed in other resources, and review records if you're unsure what their retention is, or really anything else that ever comes up. So you can always give us a call if you're not able to figure it out with your records coordinator and the resources that we have online. Okay, so let's talk about each of these in turn and start with the records coordinator. Every agency and office under the governor's jurisdiction, and some other ones also, some independent agencies, has their own records coordinator. And this person is a dedicated staff person who is trained in all records management policies and procedures for the Commonwealth, and they are authorized to dispose of agency records and move them to off-site storage locations when that's appropriate. And this person should be your go-to for any questions or needs that you have. And if you don't know who your agency records coordinator is, you can always just get in touch with your supervisor and they're probably able to find out. Or feel free to get in touch with me or check our website, because we have a full list of every agency record coordinator and their phone number on the website in a handy-dandy list. So that's a good thing. But they should be your kind of first point of contact for any questions that you have with records, because that's what they're there for, basically. That's the point of having a records coordinator. So that's the first thing. The second is, and speaking of the website I mentioned, the second is our website. So that's phmc.pa.gov/archives/records-management. And that's on our website. There's a ton of stuff here, and we're always adding new resources. During pandemic, I think we've added a dozen technical leaflets on lots of different concerns too. And this isn't just for state government. This also has tons of resources for county and local government as well. And we also have information about other trainings that we do, other events that we're hosting. We have records management seminars every year, things like that. So always check in here for any questions that you might have. And like I said, we're always adding new things. So if you've looked at this a while back, it might be a good idea to come and check in again at some point just to make sure you're familiar with all the resources that we have here. And if you call me or a records coordinator with a question, we'll probably point you to one of the resources here to answer that question anyways. Okay, so I've mentioned records retention a few times already, and I thought this would be a good time to talk about the records retention schedules that the Commonwealth issues. So you might have asked yourself at some point during this webinar already, okay, Tyler's already mentioned records retention a couple of times, and we can get rid of records when their retention is over, but I don't know how long to keep my records. What do I do? And fortunately, we have records retention schedules for all state agencies that take all the guesswork out of this, so we don't have to figure it out on our own. Somebody has already decided in the Commonwealth how long every kind of record is to be kept, and we just have to follow that retention. The Commonwealth issues two different record schedules that apply to all state agencies. There's a general one that applies to everyone, and this has kind of like common office records like correspondence, reports, program files, those sorts of things. And then there's also an agency-specific schedule. There's one that's assigned to each agency, and that has records that are unique to each agency. So I'm going to talk about both of these. And as I mentioned before, if you work at a different level of government, county or local or school district, there's going to be a different records schedule or a records management manual for you that'll have this information, because it is a little different depending on what level of government you work at. So check on our website and make sure that you're using the correct manual. So we have all of these there. These schedules are written by each agency's council along with the Office of Administration and the State Archives, and they're approved by the Governor's Executive Board. And the Administrative Code of Pennsylvania clearly states that agency staff must follow the retention and disposal procedures that are laid out in the appropriate schedule for you. So let's talk about this general schedule a bit. So like the name implies, this is a long list of different kinds of records that are generally found in all state agencies. And I mentioned before, this is things like correspondence, reports, financial documents, HR records, those sorts of things. Everyone has these kinds of things, no matter what kind of work you do. Each entry in the schedule has instructions on how long to keep the records, and then how to dispose of them after that retention time expires. And this is the front page of the schedule, or of the manual rather. Some of you hopefully have seen it before. It gets updated every so often, so if you maybe have an old printed out copy of it, just check on our website and make sure that you've got the most up-to-date one. And this is what most pages in the general schedule look like. So it can be a little hard to read if you've never seen it before, but once you get to know it, it's pretty clear and simple. I've circled here in red all the important pieces of information that are listed for each different kind of record in the general schedule. And we'll start from the left. First, there is a record or item number on the left end, and that's just something to identify the number so that if you're talking with another agency or you're talking to your records coordinator, you can quickly give them the citation for the record and they can look it up here in the schedule. The second thing next to that, number 2, is an official records title. and we have that, and that's kind of the official record. Your office might call a record something different, so just be careful here. If you don't have the exact same name, you might still be talking about the same thing. And to help kind of make that a little bit clearer, at number 3 here, I have right under that, there's always a description for every kind of record. And that so that, maybe one person calls something constituent correspondence and somebody else calls it letters received from the public, even though you're talking about the same thing. The description of the record will make it pretty clear exactly what we're talking about, so everyone's on the same page and we know if we're looking at the correct record and retention for whatever you have in your office or not. And then moving on a little bit more to the right, then we will have an agency retention. So it says agency retention, and next to that, SRC retention. And these two numbers that are here will tell you exactly how long the record is supposed to be stored in your office and at the State Record Center if that happens. The State Record Center is another facility that our office runs, and this is where records typically that have very long retention times, they're stored there when they're inactive, but you still have to hold on to the records. Not everything has State Record Center retention, but if it does, it will be listed here, and that's something your records coordinator can help you with. And finally, on the far right-hand side column, it has a disposal code, or DISP code. And this will instruct you on how to dispose or get rid of your records after the retention time has passed. So for this first record that we have on the screen, it says reorganization studies, and they need to be kept here. It says for 4 years in the agency, and then afterwards they have a disposal code of 2. And we'll talk about those retention codes and what that 2 number means in another slide. Okay, but this is pretty much what everything in the general schedule looks like, and this is what you should expect when you're flipping through it. So it's pretty easy to find what you're looking for. A lot of times when I use this, I just do a word search for the type of record that I'm looking for, if it's correspondence or financial or purchasing or something like that, and you can easily find what you're looking for pretty quickly. Okay, so along with the general record schedule, every agency has their own agency record schedule as well. And these agency schedules contain records that are unique to your own agency because of your specific agency functions. So for example, the Department of Health is the only agency that has birth certificates that they create. So they have a separate, on their agency schedule, they have a special listing just for birth certificates. The Department of Education has school licensing records, so they have special entries for that, the things that aren't found in other agencies. And your agency schedule is also authorized by Management Directive 210.5 and the Administrative Code, and these schedules are created entirely by your agency's administration, so your leadership and your council are the ones who make this. Your agency record schedule looks almost identical to the general record schedule, except that the records, of course, that are listed in here are going to be different because they're unique to your agency. This is the front cover for the agency schedule for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, which is where I work. So, we have records that are related to historical documents in the state, special boards and commissions that we run that other agencies don't have, that have, special requirements for how long their records and minutes need to be kept, things like that. But you would have your own. Every agency schedule, these are internal documents, so they're not going to be on our website. But if you get in touch with your agency records coordinator, they'll be able to share a copy with you, or you can get in touch with us because we have access to them as well. But it's not something that's out there on a publicly available website or something like that. But you probably have one. I know a lot of agencies keep them on their intranet sites as well, so you might want to look there. Your agency schedule is going to read basically the same as the general schedule too, so each record will have its own number listed, an official title, a description like we talked about, its retention time, and disposal instructions. And now if you look here on the far right column, we talked about this before on the last slide, it has that disposal code, and this one says it has a 2. So you might be asking yourself, what does disposal code 2 mean? So let's talk about that. There's a guide in the beginning of the record schedule that says what each of these disposal codes means. There's, I think, 7 or 8 of them. And I have on screen here the 4 most common ones that you're probably going to encounter with your records. Most records that we have in the Commonwealth are going to be a disposal code 1, and this means routine disposal. They're just regular day-to-day records. They don't have any confidential information in them. And these are the kinds of records, when they hit their retention, you can go ahead and recycle them like you would any other scrap paper in your office. So that's just a kind of a routine thing. A code 2, a disposal code of 2, means that those records have been identified for potential archival or historical value. So when you have those records at the end of the retention, you or your records coordinator should contact my office, the Pennsylvania State Archives, and we'll have a staff person review those records, and then we'll determine what we want to do with them next. We may transfer them to the archives. We may determine, no, these aren't archival and you can go ahead and dispose or get rid of those records or something else. But these records cannot be destroyed or discarded without the state archives approval beforehand. A code 3 for the records means that they're not historical, but the records have confidential information in them, and they should be destroyed securely. And so this is typically going to be, you need to shred or incinerate those records so that, somebody can't go dumpster diving and find those records or something because they have secure information in them. And again, this is something your agency records coordinator can help you and assist with making sure that you have either shredding equipment or that a shredding company picks up these records and destroys them that the Commonwealth has a contract with or anything else. So they would be the person to contact if you have a disposal code of 3. And the other common disposal code is a 6, which means delete the records. And this is what we have for electronic records, which everybody, of course, now has tons and tons of electronic records. Sometimes deleting electronic records is more than just putting that file in your computer's recycle bin. You may need to make sure that all copies of that record are deleted, whether they're on your computer specifically, or they're on, a SharePoint site, or they're stored in cloud storage, or they're on a CD that may be on a shelf, or anything else. And this may be something just to talk with your IT department and make sure that, you are actually deleting records instead of just deleting one single copy or something like that. So like I said, these are the most common ways that we dispose of records, and the general schedule and your agency schedule will explicitly say which one of these disposal methods is what you need to use for your particular type of records. So we don't want to have any surprises. It's very, very clearly stated. So no matter how you're disposing of your record, you need to make sure that disposal happens after, and I mean that after the full retention period has ended. So if it says a record needs to be kept for 8 years, you cannot dispose of it until after that 8 years has passed. Or if it says, after you dispose of these records after this employee has separated from Commonwealth employment, it has to be after that point. You cannot dispose of records ahead of time. Also, if a record is subject to any current legal holds or audits, it should not be disposed even if its retention time has passed. And this is something where you just might want to check with your agency counsel or your records coordinator. They will know if records have a legal hold on them or something. This doesn't happen often, but if it does and your agency is destroying records that are being currently used in litigation, that's going to cause a lot of problems down the line. So definitely check ahead of time. George is smiling over there because he knows how much of an issue that can be. If you're not sure, ask first. That's always going to help. I don't think anyone will get mad at you just double checking and making sure you shouldn't throw something in the garbage first. Sometimes there are additional legal requirements for retention that come from either the federal government or other times state legislation that might cause you to keep a record longer than what's listed in the retention schedule. And that's fine. These other regulations and legislation do supersede the Commonwealth retention schedules. So if that's the case, just double check with your records coordinator if you're not sure, but just be aware that if there's another requirement, follow that one and then follow the retention schedules. And like I mentioned before, if a record has that disposal code of 2, which says archival review, you cannot get rid of those records until the state archives has either transferred them to our office in the archives or we've given you written permission to dispose of those records. And as I've said a few times already, when a record meets its retention time, we want to dispose of it as quickly as possible. We don't want records sitting around that are past their retention because that's just going to cause more issues. It's going to take up space. It's going to give us more liabilities that we don't want to have as a Commonwealth office. The retention times that are listed in the record schedules, these aren't optional. The Commonwealth has already determined that this is how long we want to keep this particular kind of record, and we want to get rid of those records after that retention time has passed. So you need to make sure that you and your staff are following these retention times consistently. And I know, and I've worked with a lot of staff, and I have the same kind of urge sometimes too. Sometimes you have a record and you're like, oh, but I might need this again later. It's past its retention, but what if we need it for something? And you've really got to resist that urge. That's why we have these retention schedules. The Commonwealth has already decided how long we want to keep a particular record, and that's what we need to follow. And I also wanted to mention here on the slide really quickly, the right to know law clearly states that a right to know concerns don't trump assigned retention periods. So if your agency gets a right to know request for records that you've already disposed of because they've met their retention time, your agency will be in the clear. But on the flip side of that, if you have records that are past their retention time and you still have them, so you could have gotten rid of them but you haven't, that's going to pose extra liabilities and burdens on your agency because you will be required to produce those records, even if you didn't need to have them in storage. So that's something we really want to avoid. If we don't need to have a record because it's past retention, we don't want to maintain it. Okay, so I mentioned before I work in the state archives, so I'm an archivist. And what kind of archivist would I be if I didn't talk about the archives just a little bit in this records management presentation? The Pennsylvania State Archives is the designated repository for all historical Commonwealth records, anything that the Commonwealth has determined has permanent value because of either its historical value, its legal or fiscal value, or sometimes its administrative value to the Commonwealth. These records are to be kept permanently in the state archives, and we have the staff and resources to care for these paper and electronic records indefinitely. If you have records and it says on the general schedule or your agency schedule that they have archival review, or if you have records that you just think are historically significant for some reason, like I said before, do not get rid of them for any reason until you've contacted us. Even if you're not sure if the records are archival or not, just give us a call, because these are the most important records that the Commonwealth has. It's not a lot of records, but they're by far the most important ones. You can send records to the archives early, even if they haven't met their full retention period, because we will maintain them for till the end of retention and then afterwards. So if you have records that are inactive and they're taking up a lot of space in your office, but their archival review, you can give us a call and we can figure out if we might want to move them early. And the last thing I wanted to mention here quickly, sometimes I've talked with agency staff and they're concerned, if I send my records to the archives, the public will be able to see everything and it'll just be totally opened up to the public, and we don't want that because there's confidential information. And that is not the case. We restrict records in the archives to the general public just like you would in your agency. Having sensitive or confidential records is not a reason to not send them to the archives. So if you have staff or if you yourself are concerned about that, just talk with us ahead of time. We review all records on a case-by-case basis when they come into the archives to determine what the appropriate restrictions are for those records. Okay, we've been talking a lot about records and records disposal, so let's review this a little bit, and then maybe I'll stop for a moment and we'll see if there's any questions that I can answer. So if we have non-permanent records, these are records with a retention time of a certain number of years. You have to keep them for 8 years, or you keep them for 10 years, or you keep them until the end of this person's employment with the Commonwealth or something. These records all should be disposed when their retention period ends. And remember, like we looked at earlier, you can always find the retention period of a record, of any record, by looking in the record schedules or just by checking with your records coordinator, and they can help you figure out what the designated retention time is for a record. But if a record has that archival review designation, if it says disposal code 2, then you must get in touch with the archives so we can figure out if it needs to be transferred to archives or what we need to do. So we will give you permission to basically how to get rid of those records and remove them from your office, whatever way it's going to be. And again, right to know laws do not trump these retention policies and these disposal procedures. You need to follow the retention that is stated in the record schedules first, and then right to know concerns should come second after that. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. Let me pause for a moment and just see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to type them in to the chat or the conversation thing below. And let me scroll up to see if anyone has any questions so far.
I'll jump in here real quick. Heather has pointed out that we may have sent out the wrong PowerPoint yesterday. That would have been our fault here at the Office of Open Records, not Tyler. But fortunately, we do have a copy of this PowerPoint on our training page. The link's included if you scroll back through the messages. And, if you want to follow along using the PowerPoint locally on your own computer, you can do that, or feel free to print it out. But we'll get it sorted out, and we apologize for any confusion there. And thanks for pointing that out, Heather.
All right, thanks, George. I didn't realize that, so hopefully nobody was too confused. And like we said earlier, if you have a question or something that I'm not addressing specifically here, you are more than encouraged to just get in touch with me or get in touch with George first, and he can reach out to me. But George and I, our job is to clarify these policies and procedures and records retention rules, to assist you in making sure that you're following these and being compliant. So if anything that I'm talking about today isn't crystal clear for you, I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with George or I or your records coordinator if you know who they are, and we'll get you on the right track. Okay. So I don't have any questions coming in yet, but like I said, feel free to type it in anytime you have a question or something on your mind, and then we'll pause again in a little while later on to cover other questions. Okay, so let's keep moving and talk about electronic records. Everybody has electronic records. It's 2021. If you do your job every day and don't have any electronic records, then I would be surprised. I've never met anyone like that. You're unique in the Commonwealth. I think everyone has electronic records, and we're making more all the time. It's I think I don't know what the numbers are, but it's like it exponentially increases every year how many electronic records that the Commonwealth generates and maintains. But it's really important to remember that we need to apply records management practices to our electronic records just the same as we would with paper stuff in our office. Remember, like we said before, with the definition of a record that the Commonwealth has, it's all about the information in the record. It's not about what format it is. It's that information that really counts, and that's where everything comes from. So, we talked about before with the definition of a record, and it says the information is important regardless of the format. The retention and disposal of any paper letter that you have in your office should be thought of the exact same way that you would deal with a scanned copy of that letter or an email or anything else electronic. Electronic records is not changing anything when we're talking about the basic principles and procedures and policies for Commonwealth records. But with electronic records in the Commonwealth, it's doubly important to make sure that records are retrievable and accessible for the full length of their retention. If your agency cannot provide access to electronic records, technically they're considered destroyed by the Commonwealth. So let's say that you have old records in your office that somebody put on a floppy disk back in 2005, and today you don't have any computers in your office that can read that disk. According to policy, that record is considered destroyed, or it's considered that you don't have this record because you're not able to actually access it and provide access to that records. And you may say, oh, we don't have any floppy disks or anything like that. You'd be surprised how many we still find when I'm working with state agencies. And also just electronic records technology changes so quickly. Today computers don't even come with disk drives anymore. That's a pretty common thing. And CDs is not a really old technology. But just think about what are we going to have in 5 years or 10 years, or just think about 30 years. When we have records that have retention that is for many years at a time, we have to make sure that the technology is not limiting access to those records, because that's one of the real core requirements of records management. So make sure that you have records that are electronic. Make sure they're always accessible no matter where they are. Okay, so I get asked a lot of questions about email pretty much all the time. Everybody in my office does. People call us, they email us. They say, I have lots of email, how long do I keep it? And so the answer is always, it depends. It's not quite that simple. Like we said before, email is not a type of record. It's a format of a record. So you need to look at each, a particular email and decide, okay, what information is in this? And then so based on that information, what kind of record is this? If you have email that's coming from the secretary or a bureau chief in your agency, that's probably going to be executive correspondence. But if it's coming from another staff person, that may be routine or day-to-day correspondence. And those two things would have different retentions. Same with if you have an email with an attachment that has, I don't know, what's an example? You might have your reorganization plan, or you may have in correspondence related to licensing or relicensing of something out there in the Commonwealth or with a member of the public or something like that. It depends on what is in that email, and that's going to determine officially what kind of record it is, what its retention is, how long you need to keep it, and how you would dispose of that later on. So I think that's the really important thing to consider. Also, the other thing I wanted to talk about with email, because sometimes I get questions about this, if you have information that's only contained in an email, so you don't have it saved anywhere else, whether that's in the text of the email or as an attachment, consider maybe storing it somewhere else if it's actually an official Commonwealth record. If somebody sends you a copy of a final report and it's only an email, you might want to copy that record out of your Outlook and put it in your agency's, shared drive, or, if you have another electronic record storage area, you don't want to keep it exclusively in your Outlook account, just because if that employee separates or leaves, or somebody isn't able to find it in the email, that can cause questions down the road. We don't want the only copy of your office's reorganization plan sitting on one person's Outlook when other people might need to access it at different points. Okay, let's move on from email and talk a little bit about other electronic record storage places. Now that the Commonwealth is moving to a lot more cloud-based storage systems, we get a lot of questions about these. I think most of us have Teams and OneDrive for each of us individually, and most agencies have either SharePoint or sometimes a DocNet or some other kind of shared intranet, or a place where records are stored where people access them together or collectively. We advise agencies not to save their official agency records on an employee's personal OneDrive or Teams accounts. These accounts are password protected, and they go away once that particular agency or employee separates from your agency. And so any records that are stored in them could get lost or become inaccessible when they're needed. And that can be a real issue for our agencies. Or just say somebody's on vacation and they have the only copy of some correspondence or a file or something like that other people need. You don't want to have to depend on that one particular person, because you wouldn't be able to get into their account. So try and store official agency records on a shared drive or somewhere else where all designated staff can access that record at any time. We don't want to have it just kind of contingent on one particular person ever. Similar to that, you may have noticed that OneDrive and Teams have features where you can share documents, where a particular document or a file lives on one person's computer or one person's OneDrive, but other people will get a link so they can access it even though they're on another computer. And the same advice goes, where we recommend don't store your official records or provide access that way as much as you can. Even though you've provided a link that someone can use to get to that record, that's going to go away if that person separates or leaves your agency for any reason. We want to make sure that no matter where an electronic record is stored, any appropriate staff can always get to it no matter what the situation is. And finally, for this slide, no matter where your records are stored, try and make sure that you're consistent with how you and your staff name those documents, so how you do your file naming. Try and have clear file names that say what the record is and also what date that record was created. That way, future staff are going to know what records are, and they can figure out when the retention for that electronic record is going to end. 20 years from now, nobody's going to have any idea what that file is that's called report_version2_Dave's copy. It's not going to be helpful to anyone. Make sure that you have good file names that will help take the guesswork out of what a document is, so that people don't have to open it up and figure out what it is. They'll just see the file name and they know what it is. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk about scanning. Especially since so many of us are teleworking today, I still am for the foreseeable future, scanning our paper records has become a lot more important to the Commonwealth recently. Commonwealth and our records management policies allow agencies to scan most short-term records and then get rid of those original paper copies immediately. So when you have a scan of a record, the electronic copy then is considered the official copy of that record. And then the original paper copy is a duplicate, which you no longer have to keep. And so that's something that you can, if you have a lot of records in the office, or you have staff who are teleworking and working remotely, and it's a lot easier to access electronic copies, this is something you can probably do where you can scan the paper and get rid of that then after you've done a good scan. But I would definitely recommend check and make sure, check with your supervisor or check with your records coordinator. Make sure there isn't another reason that the paper copy needs to be retained. There are some records, and sometimes the record schedule will say this explicitly, or sometimes there's something else. Maybe it's in the legislation that applies to that particular record where it says you must keep a paper copy. And if that's the case, just make sure you're aware of that. But that's not the case with everything. So that is something where I know a lot of people say we're running out of space for our paper. What do we do? You should be able to scan some things. And I would definitely advise if you are scanning records in your office, try to prioritize scanning those records that are in use by lots of different staff or the ones that are in frequent or high demand and use. I've heard from some offices where they just assign somebody just to go through and just scan everything. Just scan every box, scan everything on every shelf or in every cabinet. And they're scanning a lot of stuff that is not used frequently, and that can be a real waste of time and space because electronic storage space also is a cost for the Commonwealth. So if something is seldom used or referenced, maybe you just want to keep that paper copy and really focus on the stuff that is a little bit more important to look at and to use often. Okay, I'm not going to go through everything on this screen, but I just wanted to point out that there are a lot of risks to electronic records. Having our records electronically or digitally makes things a lot easier for us in most situations, but there are still risks that come with this. Also, like I mentioned before, electronic record technology advances really fast. So many of the record-keeping formats that we use are kind of unreliable just because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But we've had situations where if there's a flood or even just if there's a burst pipe and it bursts onto either server space or a particular computer or something, that can damage or destroy the records that are stored on that machine. We have sometimes where hardware malfunctions, software malfunctions, people delete records by accident. Somebody might download a virus or something by accident, which can destroy records. There's a lot of things that come up. And we just need to be really careful with our electronic records because the cost to replace or recreate records can be really high, or sometimes it can even be impossible. We can't get that information back. So when we're storing records, this is kind of something, it's on all of us, no matter what your actual job is or position is, but it's on all of us just to keep an eye on our electronic records, make sure that everything is always accessible and we can get to the records that we need all the time. Like I said before, if something is it's under its designated retention period, we must be able to provide access to it when we need to. Otherwise, it's considered destroyed, and that's going to cause a lot of problems for us down the road. And we want to avoid that as much as we can. So just be aware that there are a lot of risks to the records, even when we have them electronically. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to cover with electronic records today, and we're nearing the end of this, so I'll come back and answer some questions in a moment. But I just want to talk about permanent electronic records that we have in the Commonwealth and the policies that apply to this. A couple years ago, the Commonwealth issued a new policy which deals with electronic records that have permanent or long-term, which is 10 or more years for their retention. In the past, before this policy was issued, if you had any records that had retention that was 10 years or more, you were required to keep what was called an eye-readable copy of that record. So you had to have it in paper or microfilm, something that you can physically look at it and read it. You couldn't just keep it in electronic copy exclusively. And this was the same rule actually for state, county, and local governments. But in the past few years, we've issued new policies for all levels of government, so not just state, but also county and local, that has replaced this old policy, and we call it the PDFA policy. And in a nutshell, this policy states that for state agencies, if you have records that need to be kept for 10 or more years, you are allowed to do that, and you can keep them electronically, but you must keep those records in the PDF/A file format. And this is a special version of PDF that the Adobe company makes that's designed for long-term preservation. So it's a little more reliable than, Microsoft Word, which updates every couple of years. I forget what number of Microsoft Word on, but, there's been more than 10 versions of that, and other things like that. They're just not quite as reliable. So PDF-A format is what these records must be stored in. You also must keep 3 separate copies of each record. What's called a use copy, a security preservation file, and a backup copy of those records. And the backup has to be stored separately from the other copies of those records. And the records have to be stored in a live server environment. So this is definitely a conversation to have with your IT department. But what I just want to express here in this training is that if your office has records that have retention of 10 years or more, and you want to store them just electronically or just digitally, or maybe you're just making them digitally in the first place, the Commonwealth has extra safeguards and extra policies that apply to these records, and you just need to double check and make sure that you are following them. And this is something, get in touch with your records coordinator, get in touch with my office, the State Archives, and we can help make sure that you're on the right track, because some of this is a little technical, and we want to make sure that you're doing it right. But I want you to just know, if the retention is 10 years or longer and you're keeping it electronically, there's going to be extra requirements. Again, the particulars of this policy are on our website at the State Archives, and we also have helpful guidance documents and FAQ pages, so please get in touch with us and we would definitely be able to help you out. Okay, so let's keep moving. Actually, I'm here. Actually, we're at the end of this presentation. So let me summarize what we've talked about today. We started by talking about what records management is for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and its state agencies, and what managing our records is. We want to keep our records for as long as we need to, for as long as they have retention, and then we want to get rid of them as quickly as we can. We want to dispose of those records so that they're not causing any liabilities or extra costs for us. Then we talked about what defines a record and how it's the information that's really important. It's not the format. So you have to look at a record and the information it contains to figure out what it is and what you need to do with it and how long you need to keep it. And then we talked about what resources we have to help manage our records. So we have our agency record coordinator, and they're our go-to person. And then we talked about the record schedules that we have on the State Archives website. And we talked about that, myself and my colleagues here in the State Archives and from the Office of Administration are always around to help as well. So you can always get in touch with us. Then we talked about the record schedules themselves and how they have instructions on retaining and disposing every different kind of record, and how we need to make sure that we're complying with those assigned records retention schedules and we're doing what it says in them. Okay, and then we wrapped up and we talked about some of the big questions and issues with electronic records. So we talked about email and how, again, it's not the format that's important, but it's the information in each email that helps us determine what it is. And we also looked at scanning records, storing records in cloud storage, and what to do with those longer term records that have to follow that PDFA policy. So those are the other kinds of things. And again, we have all this information on the website, so I definitely recommend checking in there. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation portion of this. Keep on submitting questions. I see we have a couple of here in the chat already, so let me look at those. But like I said, feel free to contact me at any time if I haven't addressed a question that you might have, or get in touch with George if there's anything that you might have for him as well. Okay, so I've got a question here from one individual who says, we generate literally thousands of emails every month. Do we need to review the content of every email? This could be a full-time position. And you're right. Everyone has tons of emails. I don't know how many thousands of emails I have in my own Outlook account as well. That's not an easy question. I mean, I think it's up to the staff. So if you know that in general the types of emails that a particular staff person is creating and maintaining in their Outlook account is going to be, say they're a management staff or they're an executive staff person, you're probably going to want to pay more attention to that than if somebody is, they're a little bit lower down, if they're a clerk or something else. I think it's really, it depends on what that person is doing and what types of records they're typically dealing with. If somebody is dealing with a lot of, they're emailing a lot of agency records, but there's copies of those records somewhere else, then you probably don't have to worry about it as much. But if there's a chance that somebody is emailing something or they have information that is like unique copies of information about agency business, you might need to be a little more careful with that. So I feel like that's kind of a non-answer. It depends. That's the best information I can give you, but feel free to check in with me. Feel free to give me an email and just tell me a little bit maybe about what your office is doing, and I might be able to give you a little bit more tailored suggestions or advice on what to do in your particular situation. But the heart of the matter is I just want everyone to be careful. there's information in our employees' email accounts that may be considered official Commonwealth records. And we want to make sure that somebody isn't just deleting all their emails at the end of the year or something like that, because sometimes people do that. They have kind of their own personal record keeping practices that they might think, oh, it's my email, so I don't have to worry about this. And we don't want people to do that. So just be careful when you have records that are in the email that you're treating them appropriately and whatever the retention is for them. Okay, no other questions here at the moment, but I can pause for a minute and see if anyone else has anything on your mind.
I'll jump in here real quick. As always, Tyler's given us a lot of good information here. And if you want a recording of this presentation, we're recording it now. You can send a flash drive to the Office of Open Records with a note and a self-addressed stamped envelope, and we'll make a copy on your flash drive and return it to you. Keep in mind that I am out of the office next week, so there would be a slight delay with this particular recording. But we can't email it to you, unfortunately, because of the file size. But send us that flash drive, and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the recording.
Thanks, George.
Hello?